Did you come out of the trash can to watch this show? Let's see if your laughter can survive my music.
Can I play it for food? They laughed at the homeless veteran, not knowing he is piano legend. The chandeliers blazed in the grand legacy ballroom, scattering light across crystal glasses and sequined gowns. Laughter chimed above the clink of silverware as the city's wealthiest paraded their elegance, certain that nothing could intrude on their flawless evening. But then the doors at the back opened, and a figure entered that seemed cut from another world. He was old. His coat was frayed, his shoes worn thin, his beard rough with neglect. The hush that fell was brief but sharp, replaced almost instantly by nervous laughter and disdainful whispers. Guests turned away, offended that poverty had crossed the velvet rope. Some frowned, others smirked. The man paused, eyes sweeping the room not with desperation, but with a strange calm. His voice, when it came, was quiet, yet carried to the farthest table. "If I may," he said, "I would like to play your piano, just for a meal." For a heartbeat, the ballroom stilled. Then came the laughter, scornful, merciless. "Play it for food?" someone repeated, as though the words themselves were a joke. Richard Thompson, a developer with a reputation for cruelty as polished as his cufflinks, rose from his seat, seizing the moment. "A fair trade, don't you think?" Richard's voice boomed. "One song for supper, but let's make it interesting. If this gentleman can play so well that even one of you sheds a tear, I'll buy him not only the best dinner in the city, but give him $1,000 in cash." The crowd erupted in cheers and jeers, their amusement sparked by the cruelty disguised as sport. They turned to the old man, expecting him to slink away. But instead, Walter Hayes, though none knew his name, inclined his head. "I accept." The words were steady, not desperate. The ballroom, still laughing, failed to see what had just entered their midst. They saw a beggar with calloused hands. They did not see the veteran who had carried music through the smoke of war, the pianist once hailed as a legend before vanishing into rumor and silence. And now, in this gilded room of mockery, history was about to take its seat at the piano. The grand legacy ballroom was built to impress. Golden sconces cast a warm glow across walls paneled in dark walnut, while chandeliers hung like frozen constellations from a ceiling painted with delicate frescoes. Waiters in white gloves navigated the room with trays of champagne and oysters, their movements rehearsed, their smiles tight. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan glittered in the night, but inside the ballroom, wealth itself seemed to pulse as though it were a living thing. This was the annual gala of the Sterling Foundation, an event where fortunes were flaunted as much as they were pledged to charity. The room was filled with bankers, developers, socialites, and politicians, their laughter rising in crescendos that masked deals being struck in whispers. Every corner of the room radiated power. Every conversation was laced with calculation. At the center of it all, a piano stood gleaming beneath the lights, a Fazioli grand, its black lacquer polished to a mirror, its keys untouched for most of the night. It was meant as ornament, a symbol of culture amid opulence, not an instrument to be played. Few guests could even name a composer, but they relished the prestige of owning art they did not understand. Richard Thompson, tonight's most flamboyant presence, embodied this culture. In his late 40s, with silver hair combed to perfection and a suit tailored to broadcast his success, Richard was known as both a ruthless developer and a cruel entertainer. He had made fortunes by evicting tenants from their homes, and he had made enemies just as quickly. Yet here, among the powerful, his arrogance was admired. His laugh carried louder than the rest, and people leaned toward him as though afraid to be left out of his orbit. Richard's eyes narrowed when the old man entered. Where others saw inconvenience, Richard saw opportunity, a chance to display his dominance, to turn another human being into a punchline. His lips curved into a smile that held no kindness. The man who had drawn their attention was Walter Hayes. 68 years old, his shoulders stooped beneath the weight of years, his clothes threadbare and patched. He looked like someone who had wandered in from the cold. His beard was unkempt, his shoes worn almost to the sole, yet his eyes, pale gray blue, were steady, even luminous. They did not dart with shame or plead with hunger. They observed, quiet and unyielding, as though he were the one judging the crowd. Most guests dismissed him instantly, whispering sharp comments about security lapses. "How did he even get in?" hissed one woman in diamonds. "Disgraceful." Another man chuckled. "Must have smelled the champagne from across the street." But there were exceptions. Emily Carter, a young waitress working her first gala, froze with her tray when she saw him. Something about the way Walter carried himself, the quiet dignity beneath the ragged clothes, unsettled her. She thought of her father, a mechanic who had fought in Iraq and come home a changed man. Emily lowered her eyes, but when she glanced back, Walter's steady gaze met hers. She felt an inexplicable pull of respect. Nearby, Abram Stevens, a philanthropist known more for sincerity than spectacle, also studied the man carefully. In his late 60s, Abram had lived long enough to recognize the gravity in another veteran's stance. He had seen it before, in friends who had survived battles no one wrote about, in eyes that never forgot. Something about Walter was familiar, though Abram could not yet place it. Richard, however, saw none of this. To him, Walter was a prop. He stood, lifting his champagne flute like a conductor preparing an overture, and mocked the man openly. The crowd, already conditioned to laugh at Richard's cruelty, followed suit. And so, in a room filled with power and privilege, the stage was set. Richard, the arrogant host, certain of his superiority. Walter, the unassuming intruder, carrying a hidden history no one could fathom. Emily, the waitress whose compassion marked her apart. And Abram, the philanthropist, whose recognition would soon reveal a truth long buried. The piano gleamed between them, silent, waiting. The laughter built like a cruel tide. Richard Thompson raised his hand for silence, his silver cufflinks flashing beneath the chandelier. He turned to Walter with a smirk sharpened by decades of unchecked power. "So," Richard said, voice dripping with false benevolence, "you want to play our piano? For food? What a bargain." He glanced at the crowd, and the room rippled with snickers. "Shall we indulge him, ladies and gentlemen? Shall we let this man earn his supper?" The guests clapped mockingly, their applause hollow. Someone shouted, "Make him dance first." Another chimed in, "Hope he knows something more than chopsticks." The cruelty thickened the air. Walter Hayes stood motionless, his hands clasped in front of him. He did not shrink from their jeers, but neither did he return their scorn. His face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the piano, as if only it mattered. Richard stepped closer, his smile curdling. "Tell you what, old man, if you can move even one of us to tears with your little performance, I'll buy you more than dinner. I'll give you $1,000, cash." He pulled a crisp wad of bills from his pocket and slapped it theatrically on the lid of the piano. The money sat there like bait, the crowd buzzing at the spectacle. "And if you fail," Richard continued, leaning in, "you'll leave quietly, never to darken this door again. Do we have a deal?" The guests roared approval, intoxicated by the cruelty disguised as entertainment. They leaned forward, eager to watch humiliation paraded on polished ivory keys. Walter finally lifted his gaze from the piano. His eyes met Richard's, not with defiance, but with a calm so steady it unnerved the younger man. "I accept," Walter said simply. A hush swept through the ballroom. No tremor of desperation clung to his words. No plea, no fear, only quiet certainty. Emily Carter, still clutching her tray near the wall, felt her throat tighten. She wanted to speak, to shield him from the jeers, but her voice caught. Instead, she whispered a prayer no one heard. "Let him play. Let them see." Richard gestured grandly to the instrument, his arrogance on full display. "Well then, Maestro, show us what you've got." Walter approached the Fazioli Grand, each step slow, deliberate, his worn shoes soft against the marble. He lowered himself onto the bench, his spine straight despite the years etched into it. His hands hovered over the keys, fingers gnarled, rough, marked by a lifetime of work and war. The crowd leaned forward, eager for the farce to begin. But in that moment, something shifted. Those who looked closely saw it. The way his posture changed, the way his shoulders squared, the way his eyes softened as he gazed at the keys. He was no longer a beggar at a gala. He was something else entirely, though none yet understood. Richard chuckled, trying to break the silence. "Any day now, old man. We haven't got all night." Walter exhaled slowly, as if releasing years of silence, and lowered his fingers. The first notes rang out, soft and haunting, and the ballroom that had moments ago been filled with laughter grew still. The music was not loud, not flashy. It was a lament, each chord heavy with memory, each phrase carrying sorrow too vast for words. The jeers died on lips. Champagne glasses froze halfway to mouths. The cruelest men and women in the room sat transfixed, caught off guard by the depth that flowed from those calloused hands. The wager had begun, though none of them realized yet that the contest was already lost. The melody that spilled from Walter's hands did not belong to the glittering ballroom. It belonged to dusty roads and lonely nights, to memories carried in silence and pain buried so deeply it could only be spoken through music. Every note seemed to open a door in his mind, and behind each door was a fragment of the life that had brought him here. He had been born in 1952 in a small town outside Charleston, West Virginia. His father worked the coal mines until black dust carved years off his lungs, and his mother sang hymns in a soft alto voice that wrapped the children in warmth even when the cupboards were bare. Walter had discovered the piano in the church basement, a battered upright missing 3 keys. At 10 years old, he would slip inside after school, fingers fumbling at first, then learning to coax melody from broken ivory. It was in those quiet hours that he first understood. Music was not just sound. It was a language older than words, a way to tell truths too heavy to carry alone. A local teacher, Mrs. Avery, noticed. She gave him lessons for free, calling him gifted, though he never believed it. By 16, he was playing Chopin and Debussy with a fluency that startled even her. She urged him to audition for conservatories, but Walter's family could not afford the luxury of dreams. The Vietnam draft swallowed him before he turned 19. The jungle was not a place for music, yet Walter carried it with him. He was assigned to a field unit, where days blurred with mud, fire, and fear. At night, when silence fell heavy, he would tap rhythms against his rifle or hum phrases from memory, comforting the men beside him. They nicknamed him Maestro, a strange title amid war, but it stuck. He learned then that music could steady trembling hands, slow racing hearts, remind boys they were human even when the world demanded otherwise. But war marked him. He returned with medals he never showed and nightmares he never confessed. The piano became both sanctuary and confession booth. He poured his grief into keys, each practice session less about art and more about survival. For a time, he even built a name, playing in jazz clubs, then concert halls, critics marveling at the raw emotion in his interpretations. But fame unsettled him. Crowds cheered his brilliance, yet none saw the ghosts behind it. Tragedy pushed him further into silence. His wife, Clara, died in a car accident when their daughter was only 6. Grief hollowed him. He threw himself into music until the sound of the piano itself became unbearable, a reminder of all he had lost. He abandoned the stage, disappeared from programs, and rumors whispered that he had died. In truth, he walked away, choosing anonymity over applause. Years passed. He gave anonymously to veterans' causes, funded scholarships for young musicians under pseudonyms, but lived simply, drifting city to city. To the world, he was gone. To himself, he was merely waiting, though he could not have said for what. Now, sitting before the gleaming fazioli, Walter's memories braided with the music beneath his hands. The first piece he chose was his own lament, improvised from fragments of hymns his mother once sang. Its notes wept without shame, pulling from the depths of every ear in the room a flicker of recognition, sorrow, loss, longing. Guests shifted uncomfortably, champagne forgotten. For some, the sound touched wounds they kept hidden beneath silk and diamonds. When the last chord faded, Walter did not pause. His hands leapt into Chopin's revolutionary etude, a storm of fury and fire. Here was the anger of war, the violence of chaos, the rebellion of a soul refusing to yield. His fingers blurred across the keys, every arpeggio a cry against cruelty. Richard Thompson, who had started the wager, leaned back uneasily, his smirk thinning as the music rose like a tempest around him. Then, as the storm subsided, Walter turned to Debussy's Clair de Lune. The contrast was shattering. Notes fell like moonlight, tender, luminous, fragile enough to break hearts. The ballroom, so used to chatter and spectacle, grew utterly still. People forgot to breathe. Emily Carter, the waitress who had felt compassion from the start, felt tears pool before she realized. She wiped her cheek quickly, but Abram Stevens, standing nearby, noticed. He, too, felt his throat close as the melody unfolded, and in that moment, recognition struck Abram. Decades earlier, while serving overseas on humanitarian missions, he had heard of a soldier pianist whose playing could quiet even the most haunted barracks. A man rumored lost in battle, honored posthumously. Abram whispered under his breath, hardly daring to believe. Walter Hayes, the maestro of the front. The final notes of Clair de Lune shimmered into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Abram's voice rose, unsteady but clear. "It's him. He's alive." The crowd turned, startled. Whispers erupted. Walter sat silently at the piano, hands folded, expression calm, as though he had simply fulfilled his side of the bargain. But the truth of his identity had slipped free, and the tide in the room was shifting. For several long seconds, the grand legacy ballroom remained suspended in silence. The final echoes of Clair de Lune still shimmered in the air, fragile as glass. Guests sat frozen, their jeweled fingers hovering above untouched crystal flutes, their eyes wide with something they hadn't expected to feel: shame, awe, wonder. Richard Thompson was the first to break. He forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "Parlor tricks," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand, though his face had lost its color. "Anyone can bang a few keys and make the sentimental types tear up." But his words fell flat. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Walter Hayes. Abram Stevens rose from his chair, his voice carrying across the hushed hall. "This man is no beggar. This is Walter Hayes, the soldier musician the world believed lost decades ago. I knew of him during my years with the Veterans Foundation. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, posthumously, after a mission that nearly destroyed his entire unit. They said he didn't make it back." Abram's throat caught, but he steadied himself. "Yet here he stands, and you dared to mock him." A murmur swelled into a wave. Heads turned toward Walter, then toward Richard. Guests who had laughed now looked stricken. Emily Carter, the young waitress, pressed her hand to her lips, tears streaming freely. Walter rose slowly from the piano bench. He placed one weathered hand on the gleaming lid, grounding himself in the instrument that had carried his soul through war and grief. His voice, when it came, was low but unshakable. "I came here tonight not for spectacle, but for truth. Too often, wealth blinds men to the value of those who built the foundation beneath them. Too often, sacrifice is forgotten once the banners are folded away. I wore these clothes not because I am poor, but because I wished to see who among you would still recognize dignity in a man who seemed to have none left." His eyes swept the room, pausing on Emily, then Abram, before landing on Richard. "Now I know." The guests shifted, uneasy. For the first time, they saw themselves as they had behaved, a crowd quick to scorn, slow to show mercy. The glitter of diamonds no longer sparkled so brightly. Walter straightened, his frame no longer stooped, his presence filling the cavernous ballroom with a quiet authority. This gala was meant to honor veterans. Instead, its host mocked one. That ends tonight. Richard's protest caught in his throat. The tide had turned, and there was no laughter to shield him now. Richard Thompson tried to rally, his voice rising with forced bravado. "You can't just walk in here and—" "Enough," Walter said, his tone cutting through the room like the first strike of a conductor's baton. It was not loud, but it carried. Every head turned back toward him. His posture was unshaken, his pale eyes calm, the steady presence of a man who had endured storms far worse than the jeers of the rich. He stepped away from the piano, moving into the center of the ballroom. His ragged coat hung loosely from his shoulders, yet in that moment he seemed taller than anyone in the room. "You made a wager," he said to Richard. "If I could move one person here to tears, you would buy me supper and give me $1,000. Look around." The crowd turned almost in unison. Emily Carter stood by the wall, tears streaking her cheeks. Abram Stevens' eyes glistened openly, his hand gripping the edge of his chair. And beyond them, dozens of others dabbed at their eyes, some not even realizing they wept, until Walter's words pointed to their tears. "You owe me more than a meal," Walter continued, his voice steady. "You owe everyone here an apology." Richard's face flushed crimson. He sputtered, pointing a trembling finger. This is manipulation. They're crying because they're soft, not because you're special." Abram rose to his feet, his tall frame commanding attention. No, Richard, they're crying because they finally heard truth, something your money has never been able to buy. The murmurs grew into a swell of agreement. Guests who had moments ago laughed now looked at Richard with disgust. Some shook their heads, others whispered angrily. The tide had shifted fully. Walter let the silence work, then spoke again. This gala was meant to support veterans, men and women who sacrificed their peace for yours. Yet under your watch, it became a circus of arrogance. That ends now. He reached into his coat and drew out an envelope. Emily stepped forward instinctively as if compelled, and Walter placed it in her hands. She glanced at it, her eyes widening at the numbers written inside. $5 million, Walter announced. That is my donation to the Sterling Foundation. Tonight, you will use it properly to house, feed, and support those who have been forgotten. And starting immediately, Emily Carter will oversee community outreach. She has shown more humanity in a single glance than you, Richard, have shown in your entire career. The room erupted in gasps. Emily's hands trembled, her lips parting as if to protest, but Walter gave her a small, reassuring nod. You saw me as a man, not a spectacle. That is leadership. That is compassion. Richard staggered back, his voice breaking. You can't just fire me. Walter's gaze sharpened. I own the controlling stake in this foundation. You were chair only because I allowed it. As of this moment, you are removed from your position, effective immediately. The words landed like thunder. Richard's allies shrank away, unwilling to stand beside him. His laughter, once infectious, now sounded grotesque. He reached for the $1,000 he had slapped on the piano, but Walter's hand was quicker. The old man lifted the cash, turned, and pressed it gently into Emily's hand. This is yours, he told her, not as charity, but as proof that kindness has value. Tonight, you stood taller than the man who sat at the head of this room. Emily's tears spilled again, but this time they carried pride. Walter looked back at the guests. I was not here to embarrass you. I was here to remind you. Wealth means nothing without humanity. Prestige means nothing without humility. And music will always outlast both. The room broke into applause. It began with Abram, his hands clapping firmly, then spread until the walls themselves seemed to shake. For once, the ovation was not for spectacle, but for truth. Richard, pale and humiliated, slunk toward the exit, ignored by those who once hung on his every word. His departure was not dramatic, it was pitiful. A man stripped bare of respect, left only with the hollow sound of his own footsteps. Walter turned back to the piano. For a moment, he rested his hand on the polished lid, as if bidding farewell to an old companion. Then he looked out at the crowd, his face calm, his voice quiet, but carrying to the farthest corners. Remember this night, not because of me, but because of what you felt when you listened. Hold on to it. Let it change you. Then, without another word, he stepped down from the dais. The crowd parted instinctively, a corridor of silence and awe opening before him. He walked slowly toward the ballroom doors, the ragged coat brushing against gowns worth fortunes, his worn shoes tapping against marble. And when the doors closed behind him, it felt as though a legend had slipped back into the shadows, leaving behind not absence, but a presence that would linger in every heart that had heard him play. Richard Thompson had always believed himself untouchable. For years, his money and swagger had silenced critics, turned cruelty into entertainment, and made sycophants laugh even when their stomachs churned. But that night, stripped of power, he looked like a man suddenly aware of his own smallness. As he stumbled toward the exit, whispers followed him, not the admiring kind, but the whispers of scorn. Shameful, disgrace, mocking a veteran? The words burned hotter than any spotlight. Allies who once clung to his orbit turned away, unwilling to meet his eyes. No one extended a hand. No one offered comfort. The crowd that had laughed at his jokes only an hour before now recoiled, as though afraid of being stained by his presence. His face was ashen, his jaw tight with fury, but his protests rang hollow. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. "I'll take this to court. Yet even he seemed to know the words carried no weight. Abram Stevens stood tall. Emily Carter clutched the donation envelope, and the guests knew where the true authority lay. Richard had been measured, exposed, and dismissed, all before their eyes. Security appeared at the door, not because Walter had requested it, but because the staff had already sensed the shift. The guards did not touch Richard. They didn't have to. The room itself had exiled him. With his head bowed and his arrogance broken, he slipped into the corridor beyond the chandeliers, swallowed by a silence colder than ridicule. Inside the ballroom, a different energy took root. For the first time all evening, the gala felt honest. Guests straightened in their chairs, some ashamed, some inspired. A few approached Emily, thanking her quietly for the dignity she had shown when no one else had. Abram raised his glass, not in a toast to wealth or power, but to gratitude. And at the center of it all, though Walter had already left, his presence lingered. The piano keys still glistened under the lights, the air still carried the memory of his music, and the lesson still reverberated in every heart. Arrogance collapses quickly when confronted with truth. Richard Thompson's downfall was complete, not because he lost his position, but because he lost respect. Without it, his empire of mockery crumbled into dust. The chandeliers still gleamed, the champagne still sparkled in crystal glasses, but the grand legacy ballroom no longer felt the same. The laughter had died, replaced by a solemn awe that clung to every guest. The night had begun as a pageant of wealth. It ended as a lesson in humility. Emily Carter stood near the piano, the envelope still trembling in her hands. $5 million. It felt impossible, yet Walter's words echoed in her mind. "You saw me as a man, not a spectacle. That is leadership." Her life, once tethered to double shifts and overdue bills, had changed in an instant. More than opportunity, Walter had given her a mandate to ensure compassion guided the foundation's future. She wiped her cheeks, straightened her posture, and felt a strength she had never known. Abram Stevens moved through the crowd with the quiet gravity of a man reborn to purpose. When Walter entrusted him with leadership, it was not flattery, it was responsibility. He saw in the stunned faces of the guests a chance to redirect their wealth toward something greater than vanity. Tonight would not be remembered for glittering gowns or champagne toasts. It would be remembered as the night arrogance was unmasked and dignity reclaimed its place. And Walter Hayes? He was gone. The ballroom doors had closed behind him, and he had vanished into the Manhattan night as quietly as he had arrived. Some would call him eccentric, others a ghost. To those who truly understood, he was both soldier and maestro, a man who carried music not for applause, but for truth. He had no need to stay for gratitude. His lesson had been delivered. his task complete. Outside, the city hummed with its endless rhythm. Walter walked through the streets, coat pulled tight against the wind, his steps unhurried. To the world, he looked like just another weary old man disappearing into the crowd. Yet for those who had seen him at the piano, he would remain unforgettable, a reminder that greatness wears no costume, and compassion often arrives dressed in rags. In the days to follow, the story spread far beyond the ballroom. Articles called it the night the Maestro returned. Videos of his performance, shaky and grainy, captured tears on the cheeks of the city's elite. But beneath the headlines, something deeper endured, a recognition that the measure of a person lies not in wealth or title, but in the humanity they extend to others. And so, long after the music faded, the lesson remained. True power is quiet, true wealth is kindness, and sometimes the most extraordinary people walk among us unseen, until they sit at a piano and remind the world how to listen.